and now a associate member of ASHRAE. He's going to be presenting today on thermal comfort and his research on how that can be achieved in design and in practice. Please welcome Damon.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, guys. And hello to everybody that's online. I think moving forward, we're going to try and do these broadcasts for ASHRAE members that are outside of the Treasure Valley that can't always attend. We always do these for BSUG, but we'll hope to do this for ASHRAE as well. And then after the lecture, we'll also post it to our IDL YouTube channel. Thank Idaho Power for lunch today for the BSUG half. The rest of the lunch should be arriving soon, so we'll just have like a quick break once that comes through, which should be any moment. It's coming from across the street, so it's not that far. Let's see. So we just moved. I'm here at IDL, as Brian just said. We just moved from our 6th Street office to this office here. So afterwards, if you want, after we hand out a whole bunch of prizes, then we can go upstairs and do a tour of the new space if you want. Today, talking about ASHRAE 55, thermal comfort, and the idea that comfort is more than just a number on a thermostat. So the new theme for ASHRAE announced this year was building for people and performance, achieving operational excellence. And I know that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people in terms of lighting and things like that, but for most of us as HVAC engineers, I think a big portion of that is achieving thermal comfort within spaces. And achieving comfort takes a lot of energy. Over the last 30 years, this is a breakdown of how buildings have used energy. The most recent data from 2018 should be coming out in the next year or two. So this is the most recent that we have available. And you can see the bottom blue chunk is HVAC, and lighting has gone down a whole lot over the last 28 years or so. And it's not because we're living in caves, right? It's just that we're still getting the same number of lumens, same amount of illuminance, using better technology, using fewer watts to do so. And I think we need to do the same thing with thermal comfort. This is a whole bunch of studies that state the obvious, that people do worse at their jobs when they're uncomfortable. And it's easy for us to, I think as HVAC engineers, we get a lot of blame, rightly or wrongly, for making a building uncomfortable. And sometimes it can be easy to just mute that whole side of things and say, oh, it's just the people that are setting up the controls, or it's just the building operations manager, or it's just a really unhappy person that just needs to put on a sweater, right? And we can get immune to complaints of comfort, but it does have a very real impact on how we do our jobs and how happy we are at our jobs during the day. If it gets below 70 degrees, you might say, oh, I like it on the chilly side. Sure, but your body actually goes through physiological changes in response to a colder environment. You get goosebumps, circulation changes. It starts moving more blood to your core, which means less blood going to your head. So maybe you start thinking a little bit more slowly, but especially your blood comes away from your fingertips, which if a lot of us are typing, your typing speed will go down and you get more errors. You might also run to the coffee room and warm up your hands around a warm mug more often. Same thing above 80 degrees, and this is just looking at air temperature. Your body goes into like venting mode, right? You start sweating. Your body tries to change its metabolic rate a little bit to adjust to your surroundings. So it might not be something that you actively notice, but there are actual changes that occur once you get outside of this comfort range. And a lot of times people will say, okay, what is that number? What number should I turn my thermostat to so that I am happy? Well, there's a lot more to it than that, and that's why ASHRAE 55 is here. But just to really kind of hammer this point home, we're designing buildings for people, and I'm all about energy efficiency, right? That's kind of my world and how we look at payback periods in terms of energy efficiency options. But the utility bills in a building are often minuscule in comparison to the dollars spent for people's salaries. And this might be, pretty obvious, but over the life cycle of a building, the vast majority of dollars spent per square foot are going towards people's work. In terms of real dollars, say you're building a new 20,000 square foot building in Boise that is going to house 100 employees. Assuming construction at $200 per square foot, that's going to be a $4 million building. I realize these are kind of Mickey Mouse ballpark numbers, but just giving you a sense that if everybody in there had an average salary of $50K a year, the dollars spent per square foot in that building, the $5 million salary over the course of the year is going to outweigh the construction cost. And that's just in the first year, right? So if you are freezing or sweating in your office all the time, you're outside of that ASHRAE defined thermal comfort zone, that's going to cost each person $330 per year in terms of lost productivity. And there have been a number of studies out there about that. A groundbreaking one that came out this year from Germany was actually on students taking math tests. And they found that raising the air temperature a little bit, because they had been overcooling some of the classrooms, netted a 2% increase in math scores. And this was particularly skewed towards the female students, which had different clothing levels and metabolic rates than the male students. And this got picked up by the media, everybody, everyone from Fox to New York Times, saying, you know, engineers were freezing women out of offices, we're doing terrible things. And once again, I think that's a misreading of the actual data and how buildings should be operated, right? That there's a whole lot more that goes into it than just air temperature and design days. So what actually is a holistic measurement for comfort? Because if you look in ASHRAE, they're not going to say, put your thermostat at 72 degrees. They're going to say, look to the thermal comfort standard. And there's a couple ways we can measure that. There's the predicted mean vote. So if you were to just estimate how people are going to be behaving in a certain space, are they going to be generally on the cold side, -3, or way too hot, +3? And you want to keep it somewhere in between, from the slightly cool at -0.5 to slightly warm at 0.5. In between, it should be kind of out of sight, out of mind. They're doing fine. That is directly related to the percentage of population dissatisfied. Now, these are predictions. These are not actual responses. So what they did was they locked a whole bunch of people in a room and hooked them up to electrodes so they could actually sense when people started getting goosebumps, when they started sweating. It was the 70s, so it was fine. They could do that. And that's how we kind of came up with these equations to estimate that generally, if you're sitting outside in shorts and a t-shirt and it's 0 degrees, you're probably not going to be too happy, right? Your body's going to go through different changes, and you're probably not going to be super thermally satisfied or comfortable. All right, so those are our metrics, and there are 6 factors at play in terms of that. So first, if you're just sitting, enjoying a box of chocolates, or soon to be lunch, that is 1 MET. That's what ASHRAE defines as their metabolic units. And then if you're, say, going for a run across the country, that's anywhere from 4 to 8 METs. The ASHRAE standard is mostly focused on people sitting in offices. So if you're doing anything more than kind of walking around, it's not necessarily going to cover that. So there's a table in there, and you can see an associated MET. Reading, typing, and even walking around, that's between 1 to 1.7. So that's one thing that affects comfort. The other thing is clothing level. So if you're out on a shrimp boat and you're wearing just shorts and a t-shirt, your clothing level is at 0.3. If you are wearing full trousers and a jacket, that is a clothing level of 0.96 or close to 1. And you can build your own clothing outfits if you want. And there's also a table of just kind of standard wear that you might expect people to have. Once again, if you are super bundled up, if you're coming into the office wearing a parka, they didn't do a whole lot of tests on that. So that's kind of outside the boundaries of this particular thing. So you can only tell somebody to put on so many sweaters. And after a certain point, after 2 or 3, it just doesn't apply anymore. All right, the third criteria is air temperature, and this is what we're kind of more familiar with. One thing that gets missed and has been a focus of mine is radiant temperature, or the average of the surrounding surface temperatures. So if you parked in the sun outside and you get back in this afternoon, sure, the air temperature might be a little bit chilly, but the surfaces within that car are going to be warm and you're probably going to feel pretty comfortable on the drive back to the office. But there's a lot that actually goes into calculating what that average surface temperature is. You could hang a black ball in the middle that's got a vacuum and a thermocouple in it, and it will sense all the radiation coming from all sides, and you could get the mean radiant temperature that way. But we don't like to have giant floating orbs in the middle of our office spaces, so you have to estimate it. And P.O. Fanger was kind of the first to pioneer this in his dissertation in the 70s. And so you're approximating a human either sitting or standing, and their distance and relation to different walls, and then adding up each of the surface temperatures on each wall. If there's a window, that's going to have a big impact, so you have to divide all of that. It's very complex, but very robust way of actually averaging all the surface temperatures. And as I mentioned, this is kind of one of the dominant ways that our bodies are wired to perceive comfort within a space. The surrounding surface temperatures, our radiant perception is the biggest piece of versus convective or our kind of metabolic rates. Airspeed also plays a key role. If you are standing right above a floor vent, that's going to feel very differently than if you're in kind of a dead zone. ASHRAE 55 assumes an airspeed rate of 20 feet per minute or less. If you get beyond that, then you have to kind of do some adjustments to your operative temperature. And last but not least, humidity. We also sense the latent energy in the air. So those are the 6 factors. How do we apply them? There is step 1, we can use the graphic zone method. This is basically an advanced psychrometric chart that you're probably familiar with, but it's only suitable for a very narrow set of conditions. It's looking at people that are basically sitting at their desks, maybe typing. Clothing level of between 0.5 to 0.1, and it takes a lot of clothes to actually reach 1.0, and that's where a lot of the gender discrimination came from, or complaints of that, because a clothing level of 1.0 assumes you're basically wearing like a 3-piece suit. It also does not account for direct sunlight, and it's limited in terms of its humidity ratios. But it's better than nothing. It's better than just assuming a certain set point of the thermostat. All right, and in terms of the temperature that you're reading on this, you're looking at the operative temperature, which is an average of the surrounding surface temperatures and the air temperature. That changes a little bit. It can be weighted a little bit more heavily towards the air temperature depending on the velocity, but for most situations, you can use kind of a rule of thumb and just average the two. The second compliance option for meeting ASHRAE 55 is to use the analytical method. They have all the code for this in the book. You can program it in BASIC or Excel if you want. So I've got kind of my own Excel sheet that does all this for me. It is very robust. It takes into account all of the 6 criteria. And what it essentially does is it calculates the temperature that is on the surface of your clothes. So it will look at the convective coefficient coming off of each individual person. So that's kind of the criteria that we designed for. And we want to make sure that when we're sizing systems, instead of just sizing for, say, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, try and maintain a predicted mean vote between -0.5 and +0.5. There's a lot of complex steps going through that, right? So energy models are one way which has that code built into it. I'm a fan of Energy Plus, Open Studio, since they're free, Department of Energy resources available to you. ASHRAE, though, has also sponsored a couple of online tools that you can use through the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So here's one to actually calculate mean radiant temperature. It's available off of GitHub, but if you just Google MRT calculator Berkeley, you can design any room where your windows are, what your orientation is, and it will, and hover your cursor over any square within it, it will actually calculate what that mean radiant temperature is for that one point. So this is looking specifically at your design day, like your July 21st in Boise, hottest summer day. Am I still going to meet this criteria or not? And I think it's important to use this tool for sizing as opposed to just looking at an air temperature, because you might end up sizing your system smaller. You might be oversizing if you're just looking at the air side system only. The other tool that I use a lot is the comfort tool. That's also just available at a CBE Berkeley. And this has your 6 inputs. So if you are given a certain situation or somebody says, I'm unhappy in this environment, you can actually take measurements, put them all in here. And then what you see in this purple band is a range, right? Because we all have different sizes, shapes, preferences. But generally, this is where most people are going to feel comfortable. The lower limit here is a PMV of -0.5. Upper limit here is a predicted mean vote of 0.5. And then this red dot is where you actually are. So if you're within this band, you can use this tool to say, I've met compliance with ASHRAE 55. If you're outside of that bound, then you can't necessarily claim that. So we can actually go through and take measurements and incorporate all 6 criteria instead of just looking at a thermostat. So I use a little thermal camera. They've come down a lot in terms of size and price. You can also check these out from our tool loan library, which is free. That's another Idaho Power resource. So we've got more tools upstairs. This can plug into your phone as well. And I think it's like $250 now. We even have a smaller one that's about the size of a pencil eraser that we're doing for some research right now, and that one's really fun to work with too. So that one, you get a sense of surface temperatures. Of course, you can measure air temperature and humidity. You can log those temperatures as well using thermocouples. You know, you apply some thermal paste to one side, put some insulation tape over it, so that way you're not picking up the convective air temperature, you're actually getting the surface temperature of the wall. And you want to make sure that you cover each surface. So each wall, the floor, the ceiling, a window, if there is one in there. And then you can kind of plug that in to your calculation method or your Berkeley MRT calculator and figure out what the mean radiant temperature is over time. So we actually went around and did that. We also measured airspeed. So I've got a sonic anemometer here, which is kind of picking up air velocity within this space, can sense kind of very slow air currents, which is great. And when we carted this around and stuck thermocouples everywhere in people's offices, they were very nice to let us do that. We found generally chilly offices within the Treasure Valley. So trying to keep this anonymous, this was an office not particularly far away from here. And you can see on the vertical axis is our predicted mean vote. So we want to be above -0.5. In every situation, you know, we've got a few days layered on each other here. You can see the setback is here, and it was actually cooling more, keeping people more uncomfortable during the day. How does that translate to people in the office, how they're feeling? This is the percentage of people that we're predicting that are unhappy with that particular situation, where they're actively uncomfortable. And we were getting close to 50% of people within the office unhappy or predicted to be unhappy within that space, just based on those metrics. You're always going to have 5 people that are unhappy no matter what. That is the minimum percentage of people dissatisfied that you can actually have. If you have a room full of 100 people, there's always going to be 5 that just don't like whatever that situation is. But you want to keep it less than 20%. That's associated with the PMV of 0.5 or less. Once you get more than 1 out of 5 people that are really unhappy in that space, that's when ASHRAE says, all right, you're no longer meeting comfort criteria. You need to change that. And it wasn't just offices. We actually measured a few high school classrooms. So we went to a couple of high schools, looked at 4 different high school classrooms. I think we just picked one Wednesday when each of these were being measured. And you can see in every single one of them, it was being cold. And you can say, sure, they should just add more sweaters, or maybe this was during the school year when it's generally colder out. Actually, it was during the fall, and you can see the cooling system was coming on, dropping the air temperature on the students during the day, and it was probably getting more comfortable later in the day after the students had actually left. Right, we can do better than that as engineers or setting up controls. One thing to do would be to have our setbacks a little bit higher and have warmer surface temperatures in the morning, do more conditioning later on as the surface temperatures start to warm up, instead of just having a fixed set point all throughout the day. All right, there's a few other special considerations within ASHRAE 55. One is to make sure that your feet aren't an icebox and your head's not a furnace, right? Minimizing the vertical stratification of temperature. You can get up to 5 degrees of stratification, as long as it's less than that if you're sitting down, then you're good, you're still in compliance. If it's more than 7 degrees while you're standing up, then you're out of compliance. Solar radiation, right? My puppy knows this instinctively. We all know this. If the sun is shining on you, that makes a big difference on how comfortable you are. It wasn't until 2017 that ASHRAE actually started incorporating solar radiation into their comfort standards. So now we have it, which is great, but now we also have to account for it. And there's 2 ways to go about it. One is kind of a very complex analytical approach where you are calculating your usual mean radiant temperature, looking at the surrounding surface temperatures, which is referred to as long wave radiation, right? Those are kind of low temperatures, say 70 degrees, emitting long wave radiation. Then you also have to figure out your short wave mean radiant temperature. This is how much radiation you're getting from the sun itself. And there's a lot that goes into it. It depends on how much of your body is exposed to the sun, where the sun is in the sky, your angle of view to it. And once you calculate both of those, then you add the 2 of them together. A much simpler approach, and I imagine one that most of us will probably be taking, is the prescriptive approach, where you basically add 5 degrees to your air temperature, or assume that your mean radiant temperature is 5 degrees higher than your air temperature. Another consideration is if you're in an environment that doesn't get particularly hot and you have no conditioning equipment in it. So if you have no air conditioning equipment, there is adaptive comfort, where you're looking along the top axis of the prevailing mean outdoor air temperature. And as long as your indoor air temperature is falling within this range, then you can meet certain acceptability limits, and ASHRAE kind of gives you a pass if you're not in heating mode. But it's very limited to your activity level and what the outdoor air temperatures are. Once again, you can't be using heating at the time that you're taking these measurements, and it does not apply to a building that has cooling as an option but isn't using it. It's just for a building that has no cooling equipment installed as a design feature. Now, this is not necessarily part of ASHRAE 55, but it's something that I've come across in the midst of my research, and that is thermostat height has a really big impact on how the system is actually learning whether it should kick on or turn off. There are certain ADA recommendations to not put it above 48 inches. That is, if you walk around this building, at least in my office, I think they're still installed at 60 inches. And that makes a big difference. This was a number of offices that we measured where we had a little thermocouple installed right next to the thermostat, and then we had a thermocouple installed next to somebody's vacant office, or looked at the average of the air temperatures we're collecting and looking at just the center point in the room. And there could be a few things at play here, right? Thermostats, they don't draw a whole lot of power, but they do draw some power. So there might be some heat that's being radiated out and increasing the temperature around that. It might have to do with how high it's mounted, but in every single situation, we found a 1 to 2 degree Fahrenheit difference between where the thermostat was measuring, which is in black, and the rest of the air temperatures that we were measuring within the space. And this can have a really big impact on people when they might say, oh, I'm chilly in this place, and then the facility manager comes through and says, well, look, it says 72 degrees, you should be happy, right? Just because the thermostat says 72 doesn't necessarily mean that is the air temperature that you are experiencing, especially if you're seated lower and you have a different center of mass. Another thing, and I have to give credit here to Dr. Gardner, Dr. John Gardner at Boise State pointed this out, is people will complain about drafts. And it's true that you can have some degradation around certain windows, you know, the ceiling, shouldn't do that. The caulking around window seals degrades over time, and sure, you might get some air passing through, some infiltration. But even in new buildings, people will complain about drafts next to cold windows if it's properly sealed, because what happens is we get convective currents, right? The air basically sticks against the window and will fall down and then kind of run across the desk. So the people are experiencing a very real airflow, even though there's no air exchange between the indoors and the outdoors. But you have a very cold surface that's causing some convective currents. And for me, this is a good reason to have more insulated envelopes. So you can actually figure out what that indoor surface temperature is going to be. Once again, going back to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, because they've done a lot of research on this, they have a free tool called Therm. They also have a database of windows that you can use as well called Windows 7.7. They're a bit complex, but you can get some simple models running pretty quickly, which is great. So the National Fenestration Council, I think, NFRC, the window people that make standards, have a certain criteria for measuring what the indoor versus outdoor conditions should be to calculate kind of heat transfer through. So their system that they set up is an outdoor air temperature of 0 degrees and an indoor air temperature of 70 degrees. And if you look at just a single pane of clear glass, that indoor surface temperature is 15 degrees, which is a big difference from 70 degrees, and that's going to drive a whole lot of convection. If you add a secondary pane, I'm assuming kind of clear 3mm glass and argon in between, the inner surface temperature is 45 degrees. So much nicer, but still a pretty big delta T between that and the rest of the indoor surface temperature. If you look at a triple pane window, something that is now required for a lot of like passive homes or buildings trying to meet, say, the living building challenge, that indoor surface temperature is now at 62 degrees. So it's going to be much more comfortable to sit next to that window, not only from a mean radiant temperature standpoint, but also from a convective standpoint, because you've got a lower air velocity. And LEED is pushing this as well. So now in LEED version 4, you have an optional point for complying with ASHRAE 55. There are 2 ways to meet the standard. First is to meet ASHRAE standard 55 and still at 2010, so you don't have to worry about solar radiation calculations yet. You're good there. Or you can also look at the international standards. But basically you're looking at your design days, and instead of conditioning to a particular set point, you're conditioning according to this more holistic comfort level. So that's part 1. Part 2 is to give people the chance to do something about it. So not only are you saying, look, we sized the system correctly, let's give people some control. So you have to provide the occupants, not just the building managers, the occupants, the ability to control 50% or more of all the individual offices, as well as 50% or more of all the shared occupancy spaces. So, you know, your cubicle farms, open office areas, things like that. All right, so if you provide controls to 50% or more of those spaces and you sized your system based on ASHRAE 55, you're good to go, and you get this extra LEED point. So ideal controls, right? There's a couple parts to it. One is we size our systems based on this more holistic standard. Second is we try and control more towards that. So even if you don't have radiant floors or thermochromatic windows, at least take those into consideration. Take some of the surface temperatures into consideration for your controls, and manage some of the humidity, especially if you're using a dedicated outdoor air system so you don't get condensation on some of those cold surfaces. And if possible, anticipate loads. If you're doing a night flush in your building, you know that the surface temperatures in the morning are going to be a lot cooler. That's great because now you can bring in warmer air temperatures for the early part of the day, and then do a little bit of conditioning in the late afternoon. And then at 6 or 7, people are going to leave, and you can run it back to your set point and then do your night flush cycle again. So just kind of anticipate some of that in your control sequences if possible, and use energy models to back that up if you're advocating for that for a client. I'm a big fanboy of Amory Lovins and his Rocky Mountain Institute. And they just built their headquarters a few years ago. You can watch kind of a YouTube video of all the things that went into this building. It met every standard out there. It met Living Building Challenge, so it's producing more energy than it consumes. It's LEED Platinum. It's also built to the Passive House standards. So hyper insulated building. Triple pane windows. I think it's R50 or 60 walls, and even more insulation on the roof. What they provide are chairs with kind of vented backs, similar to kind of what you're sitting on now, but vented seats as well, so that it's kind of cooler during the summer. They have no cooling equipment installed whatsoever, but they provide each person with an individual fan. They also have electric resistant radiant mats underneath everybody's desk that they can turn on or off, as well as embedded into the ceiling. Well, I know they've got a fan above each desk, so I'm not sure about the ceiling part, but at least the walls as well. So you're going to get those nice warm temperatures that we kind of associate with comfort, coziness all throughout the winter. And since it's triple pane windows, you aren't getting those really harsh sensations of being right next to the edge of a cold surface. All right, so what are the takeaways? I think there's a way to make everybody happy. Whether you think free market economics are just a virtue in and of themselves, and we're doing everything on a dollars per square foot basis, well then advocate to your clients, your architects, your owners. Let's really focus on comfort, just purely based on a productivity standpoint, right? The other piece is, of course, we're happier people when we are more comfortable, and we don't necessarily have to spend as many watts to achieve that same level of comfort if we're using better insulation, systems that deliver heat differently, say with lower air velocities, which affects some of the comfort, or adding, say, radiant systems, a pet project of mine. VRFs, there's a lot of different ways to rethink how we're providing comfort and conditioning within the space. So ideally, kind of we're building bridges and making friends here, where we're keeping both kind of the hippy-dippy environmentalists like me over here very happy, as well as the free market economists happy by meeting a more holistic sense of people's well-being and comfort within buildings. So look up ASHRAE 55. Use some of these online tools. If you have any questions, IDL is a free resource to you, so give us a call. Use some of our thermal cameras or thermocouples, and that's what I have for you guys. So thank you. Wes, how are we doing on lunch? Okay, cool. So it might be a to-go lunch today. Sorry about that, guys. So. Okay, cool.
I actually did have a question for you.
Yeah, questions are great. Yeah.
I guess my question is, does anybody look into cold, how easy it is to adjust the clothing level to account for the temperature?
Yeah, let's just do a live view of that right now. I like to think of it as like the sweater effect. So PMV method, ASHRAE 55. Right. Here we go. So operative temperature, let's change that down to about 72. That's what we're looking at here. Airspeed, I'm going to leave that at default. Humidity, and then clothing level. You can create your own custom ensemble if you want. Or if we were to look at, say, yeah, like trousers, short sleeve shirt, socks, shoes, underwear, everything is accounted for in that. But if you were to then add a sweater to that, let's see, let's hope people are wearing underwear, t-shirts. It is overly specific. Yes, you can get long underwear in there, slippers, shoes or sandals. Yeah. Let's see. I don't think we put pants on yet, so we should probably do that. Let's do trousers. And then we can start adding in some sweaters. It also goes into like the type of chair that you're sitting on too. Your beard might be lost on this, Wes. I'm sorry. But yeah, if you start adding that in, then we can set a new clothing value and kind of move that comfort band around. It's something that's really fun to play with. So, but it doesn't. It has limits, right? Adding a sweater adds, I think it's like 0.2 or 0.3 to the actual outfit. So it's not like you're going from like 0.3 to 1 or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, Tim.
So it looks like you went around to some offices and found that things are cold.
Yeah.
Seems like the traditional design temperature is 70 to 75. Do you recommend change in air temperature?
For summer, I would definitely, yeah, look at an air temperature closer to 74, even up to 76. It's going to feel different if you're standing or walking around. And I think that's something that we don't necessarily realize if you're kind of like walking around the office and like, oh boy, this is like way too hot. But if you're actually sitting and typing and over time, you actually notice that, you know, your hands are getting a little bit cold. That's really what this standard is focused on. So yeah, because the surface temperatures were generally staying in the 70 to 72 range. And once you accounted for that, and especially sitting next to a window in the morning, having an air temperature all the way up to 76, you are just within that comfort range. Yeah. Yeah, Brian.
Kind of an observation building on that. Every time I run one of these scouts, it seems like the ranges that I get are kind of maybe high 60s or low 70s, up to like mid 80s, depending on where I put the value.
Yeah.
Has that research, that 7360 we were talking about, or has that research
Not as much as I wish it would. Yeah, this was the kind of original book. P.O. Banger wrote the literal thermal comfort manual that we still use. Library card, I need to return that. Wrote the original equations and research of like view factors that ASHRAE 55 still relies on. I would say the biggest component that we usually just overlook is surface temperatures. That just has such a huge impact. That moves that band around a whole lot more than air temperature. On this one, I'm just seeing an operative temperature, which is a blend, but normally you can differentiate the two within this tool. And you can move the air temperature up a couple degrees and it'll move it around a little bit. You start moving the surface temperatures around and it really swings that comfort level around a lot. So yeah, you could be in an office with, say, surface temperature of 68 degrees in the morning And it will still tell you that you're comfortable if you have an 85-degree airflow through the space. And then the opposite is true if you've got, 78-degree surface temperatures. It's going to want to drop that air temperature all the way down to like 60 something. Hey, food. Thank you, Lindsay. Did everybody fill out a raffle ticket or card? No. It was outside. So as you're kind of going through and grabbing some lunch, make sure that you grab a raffle ticket. People that have been coming to BSUG, they get their name in the pot like every time that they come. And if they don't win that time, then it gets put into the final pot because we have some really nice prizes. Once again, thanks to Idaho Power for this. But this is our final BSUG meeting of the year, which means we have a lot of prizes to give away. And if you are an ASHRAE member and have been interested about building simulation users group or stuff, we're going to be hosting that starting in February, I think, with Drew Crawley. We'll be doing one of the lectures. He's also going to give an ASHRAE lecture, but we'll have a separate BSUG one as well. If you come in person, you get lunch, even early like today, and the chance to win prizes in person. We also do web broadcasts, and you get your CEUs too if you want. Yeah, go ahead.
Describe the BSUG organization and American ASHRAE.
Great, yeah, thanks for the chance. So BSUG was started by the Integrated Design Lab Network as a way of kind of promoting integrated design and energy modeling and building simulation. So IDL Boise has been continuing that tradition forward. We do between 6 and 8 meetings a year, monthly usually, and it's really focused on using kind of software in your jobs, either in terms of communicating design intent with architects or sizing systems using energy modeling, or if you're just entirely new to energy modeling or looking at payback periods, ways to do that, ways to visualize data. We've got a pretty good group of speakers that come through every year. For example, Drew Crawley's lectured a number of times, and he's the guy who he's the godfather of Energy Plus, which is the engine now behind Open Studio, behind Train Trace, behind a whole bunch of different programs. So yeah, and if you have more questions, a few folks within here are regular BSUG members. You can talk to Tim Johnson. He's spoken at a few. Brian, yeah, we've got lots of folks here. So as well as Chris and Cherie, who oversee the whole program. So if you have particular suggestions or questions, you can ask them too.
Thanks, David.
Thank you guys.